We tend to live in an environment of sound bites. Because we have such a frenetic environment, we tend to solidify our thinking and then move on. And so we form thought paradigms which allow us to get through our lives, and we become a little bit too rigid in the way we view information. And so Beyond Neanderthal was conceived on the assumption that we have a blank piece of paper. Let's not start with any preconceptions at all. Let's see if we can research evidence going back as far back into history as we need to determine whether there were any clues which would point us in a direction of solving the problems which we have, or which we're experiencing in the world today. People vaguely understand that oil is extremely important in the economy, that oil actually drives the world economy by the spin-off industries that hang off or are dependent on oil. For example, there's not only the pumping of the oil out of the ground, there's the oil pipelines, there's the oil tankers, there's the service stations. The motor car manufacturers are totally dependent on oil, the aircraft manufacturers, transport, air traffic. When you add all of that up together, it's probably about, well, in those days, in 2004, when I did that, it was probably about 10.5%, 11% of the world economy. When you apply the multiplier to the income that is generated from oil, you land up with very close to 100% of the total world economy is driven by oil. And the big picture is that the world economy is $52 trillion a year, US, and that's all being driven by oil. Think in terms of a swimming pool full of water, and imagine that that swimming pool was the total amount of liquid, call it oil, that is available in the world. Up to 1975, we were finding oil and adding to the amount of oil in the pool at a greater rate than we were consuming it. On the arrival of peak oil, what happens is that you start consuming it at a faster rate than you're finding new supplies. And we've passed that tipping point, and the supplies of oil, the underground supplies of oil, are being depleted. There's quite a lot of disinformation out there as to how big the oil reserves in fact are. Some people are claiming that there's a huge deposit in Alaska. Others are claiming that there are very deep oil wells in Russia. Others are claiming that there's oil sands that we haven't yet started to mine. But the bottom line is that the oil price is clearly showing that demand exceeds supply. Because oil drives the world economy, as the supplies of oil deplete, the momentum of the world economy starts to unwind. So, for example, oil facilitates motor cars. Motor cars require roads. The motor cars require panel beaters and insurance. So oil facilitated all of that. Oil facilitates plastics, pharmaceuticals. And the bankers have fallen into the trap of believing that they can drive the economy by printing money. Where if the underlying driver of the economy, which is primary industry, is incapable of driving the economy, then the more money you pump into the economy, the more inflation you generate. And we're in that position right now. And they've lost sight of the fact that what's causing this economic deterioration is a saturation of the world markets and a shrinkage of the availability of oil. The question is, what do we do if oil is not there? What do we substitute for oil? If we're going to use, say, solar power, what is going to be used as a raw material to produce plastics and pharmaceuticals? because solar power doesn't have that capacity. And so it's not just a question of producing clean electricity, it's a question of driving the world economy. How do we do that? I don't believe there's any relationship whatsoever. There is an argument, very animated argument, very emotional argument, raging around what is causing climate change. I'm sure that carbon dioxide does act as a greenhouse gas, and it does exacerbate global warming. But the evidence is mounting that carbon dioxide is not causing global warming. And so from that perspective, oil, peak oil relative to climate change, there isn't a linkage. It appears that we are at the tail end of a warming cycle which has been in place for thousands of years. And our sun has been going through a particular cycle, which is a 26,000-year cycle. And as it comes to the end of that cycle, it's become increasingly active. And the consequence of that is that it's been flaring at a much higher level relative to its historical flaring for the last probably a couple hundred years. But the bottom line is that if and when the sun reaches the culmination point of its cycle, it's expected to go quiet. If that happens, the demand for oil will skyrocket, and the rate at which oil will be consumed will accelerate. And so the consequence of not looking for an alternative to oil is very serious, mainly from the perspective of the impact of oil on the economy. If we're going to be depleting oil at a faster rate, the economy is becoming threatened at a faster rate. And the question is, what do we do about that? And there are solutions, but it appears that our politicians aren't thinking about them at this stage.